So one of the things I often say to business owners is that the biggest risks in business are usually financial collapse or regularity and legal exposure. And what's really interesting is none of these situations start with one dramatic event. It usually starts escalating, and it happens much earlier in business, and it happens with approvals not being followed properly, oversight weaknesses in processes, responsibilities being unclear, or teams start working around processes rather than following it. And because nothing visibly shows, the business continues operating as though everything is under control, when actually underneath all of that, there's silent risks that are increasing, putting the business and the owners at significant risk. So welcome to the Build and Exit podcast. I'm Julie Wilkinson. This podcast is for founders and business leaders that are navigating growth, acquisitions, financial clarity, and exit readiness. And in this episode, we're going to talk about what happens in business to expose financial or regularity risk, and how business owners can mitigate those in practice through putting in practical steps. So one of the things we see is when small weaknesses become normal. And what do I mean by that? So operational weakness is when things don't work as they should. So people bypassing processes because it feels quicker, or they're not sure what to do. Controls technically exist, but actually they don't get followed consistently. And over time, the small inconsistencies become embedded into the culture and how businesses operate day to day. So an example of this might be credit card misuse. When we look at business processes, we find often that there's a misuse in company credit cards. So they've been introduced to teams. Everybody's got one, but actually oversight and review process isn't in place. So that would be things like there's no real detail checks on what people are spending. There isn't actually controls on the card to stop people spending on certain categories. And over time, actually, managers and businesses lose track of what people are spending. And when we do our testing, we look at what are people spending and what's the expense process like. And we find lots of examples where personal fuel goes on cards, people buy personal expenditure. And also, not just that, but within business in general, people are often bypassing ordering processes and buying things on company cards that should actually be going through the purchase order processes. Now, people might go, well, we can't really stop that because we can't stop people misusing the credit cards. But actually, with good policies and controls, you can mitigate probably 85 to 95% of the risk, because often people don't necessarily do this because they want to do something wrong or they're trying to bypass the process. I mean, obviously there are some cases of fraudulent misuse, but in a lot of cases it could just be they forgot their own personal card and they just thought, oh, it's just easier to do this, but then forget, and then nothing ever gets done. There's no way for them to pay the money back, or it gets taken off them. Or two, they don't really know what they're meant to be buying or what, and there's nothing to stop them just going off and spending whatever they want in any method that they want. And because it's always been done and the manager does it, it's just like the normal process. So some of this does come down to culture. It comes down to, well, what's been allowed to happen and what's expected. And that's generally happening because there isn't a policy that's organising how people should spend money. It's happening through people just putting in little bits of processes over time, and that just becomes the norm. So that becomes the culture, and then it becomes expected. But management don't have any processes in place to oversee that or track what's spending. And then we see scenarios where expenses are getting up to $500,000 a year. Now, we find that once it hits a certain number is when people start to look at it. So they'll go, oh, I feel really lost of control of what's been spending. But ultimately, the earlier you start putting these processes in place, I mean, you don't really want to get to the point where you're spending $500,000 a year and then find, actually, these expenses shouldn't have been spent. So that's credit card expenses. So it'd be credit card, people putting in personal expense claims, and just the way people are spending in general. So the next area is risk and governance. So as businesses scale, governance expectations change. So informal processes can work at a smaller scale, but can often not become efficient anymore. And if the structure doesn't evolve alongside the growth, then operational risk increases. And this is quietly happening underneath the surface, and then large risk exposures start happening, but nobody's actually aware of them. One area we see it in, so an example would be high value of cash handling or money laundering risk exposure. So we were working with a client that had done an acquisition. They had acquired a business that actually took high values of cash. And after the acquisition happened, so they now owned the business, it came out that a high proportion of the clients, so over 55-60% of clients, actually paid for high value goods in cash. There was actually no money laundering process in place, which is a legal requirement. So it's a legal requirement that if you're taking high values of cash over a certain value, that you are legally required to check where that money's come from. And there was no money laundering in place. So then the conversation started happening. Well, obviously, what do? You've got ethically and legally. Now, the management team that acquired this business started talking to the operational team saying, we need to put in these money launderings. And then the pushback came, but if we do this, people won't buy from us anymore. And now you have a potential situation where you've got a high profit exposure, a high risk exposure to profit in cash versus your legal requirements as a business. Now, this was in an acquisition, but obviously before the acquisition, that the business who had organically grown didn't have these processes in place. Now, ultimately, this comes down to, well, when is it highlighted? Because should they've had a money laundering audit and got checked, and it happens, myself, I actually had a money laundering audit recently. I was just randomly picked and I had a money laundering audit. So it does happen. So when you have a money laundering audit, if you'd had that and you wasn't following any of these, you have high exposures to fines and risk exposures. But obviously, if that never happens and nothing's ever checked, then you might not know that these risks are slowly increasing. Now, if you get to a certain size business in the UK, obviously you become audit regulated and then you have to follow. But even then, it can be a very complex and timely and costly process if you waited until the point where you have to do it rather than putting things in place earlier. So in this scenario, where they'd acquired and there was no policies, obviously they had to start putting things in place. Now that came at a time and a cost, and obviously a high risk exposure as well, because with the operations team saying, well, clients may actually go as well or may not buy. So that was off the back of an acquisition, but ultimately the same risk would have been there from the organic business had they have put the things in place. And obviously that, in theory, could have lowered the value of the business if they were coming to exit. Although in this scenario, the acquisition had happened without that getting picked up in due diligence, which is obviously a higher risk for the buyer. But these are the types of things that lower exit value for clients, also put high risk onto buyers, which are not always thought about in due diligence, because a lot of the focus on due diligence is always the profits and the purchase price. But actually, what is a risk to the business? What is a risk to the operational profits and the long-term sustainability of the business? It isn't always just sales and costs. There are actually market conditions and legal requirements that play a high impact into how well can that business trade and the long-term sustainable profits. So governance and risk mitigation is ultimately protecting the business from the biggest financial, but also the biggest legal risks, because the consequences of something material or significantly happening, especially with things like health and safety and those types of errors as well, and money laundering, could be high exposure. And if something material happens or significant happens, then they're the risks you want to mitigate first. So to mitigate risk exposure, we'd be looking at having at least a minimum of a risk matrix that would look at, like, well, what are all your financial regularity risks and how are you mitigating them with the policies? So I use money laundering as an example, but that's just one example. There's other risks, things like health and safety, financial risk, and other areas that would be risk exposure. And you would need a risk register to map out what are those risks, what's the consequence if those risks happens, and then how would you mitigate those risks? So if you don't have that in place, then obviously it could be that the risks are unknown and you could be overexposed. It might be you're not exposing yourself, but if you're not sure, how do you know as the business develops that you don't then breach those risks? So the idea of this risk register and governance is that you put in place what you need so that you minimise or omit the risk completely and it doesn't happen. The next area we're going to look at is lack of visibility and oversight. So this doesn't usually happen from one dramatic operational failure. It's a slow process of leaders gradually losing visibility across the business as complexity increases. And we find that once that visibility weakens, risk becomes much harder to identify early. So things could be happening in the business that you just don't know because you can't see it. We see situations where errors are either not identified or they don't get identified quickly, and because the operational review structures haven't evolved as the business has grown. We see that too much knowledge sits with specific individuals, and we see departments operating in isolation, so there isn't a communication flow or a track of process flow. We see key individuals having too much access to different parts of the system, so they can do multiple things. And recently we worked with a business where we did identify fraud within a business. Now what happened, and I have seen this regularly, actually businesses, not to scare people, but fraud and error is something that business owners have to be watched for and mitigate in their business. And what we found in this particular business is that there was one particular employee who had access to the bank, who was paying small values of expenses to themselves, and it never got picked up. So it wasn't like massive big amounts of money, it was small little amounts. So obviously because it wasn't high value, it wasn't noticed, but actually it amounted up to a high value, and I think it ended up being around about over £50,000 over a longer period of time that had been paid out the business as fraud. Now obviously that got picked up when we started to do the assessments, and that's because we started to put processes in place to pick up how you track transactions. But ultimately, before the assessment took place, the reason it was happening, yes, obviously that particular person had misused the trust of the business, but actually, whether it was fraud or error, the fact is if someone can do fraud, they can also make an error. So errors are just where people aren't necessarily intentionally doing it, but obviously people can unintentionally make errors or they can intentionally make errors. But either way, if the business and systems are allowing those people to make those errors, it means there is a risk. And actually the best solution is to mitigate those risks by putting things in place so that just can't happen. Now, how was this allowed to happen? Because key individuals had access to multiple parts of the systems that were never checked. So ultimately, if you can raise a purchase order, you can speak to suppliers, you can process on the system, and you can make payments, and there's no sign off in that process or no checks in that process, then you are giving people the opportunity to do whatever they want, whether that be intentionally or unintentionally. So not having processes means risks aren't identified, and those risks can obviously materially expose the business as time goes on, because as business grows, the value and the materiality of those risks can become bigger. So again, what may have been a risk for a business when it was smaller, when there was only 1 or 2 people, maybe 5 to 10 people working there, could materially expose them if you're then increasing to 30 or 40 employees plus. So the question is, are the risks sustainable for the level of the size of the business now? So are your processes mitigating the risk for the size of the business? Because this isn't necessarily about overkill for all size businesses. It isn't always one rule fits for everybody, but ultimately you need to have the right level of processes in place for the size of the business and the growth of the business as it comes. And so these things aren't always easy and quick to put in. It can take a bit of time to implement because you're often having to change culture and processes. So it's not something that you can just identify and go, oh, we'll put this in next week. Often you'll have to go through a bit of a process where you're bringing change into the business. So the earlier you do it, the easier it is to put in place because people get time to onboard on it. Obviously, if you identify at the point something's happening, then you just put a hard stop rule, this is coming in. It's not impossible, but it can obviously change the culture and change the dynamics, and it can put an impact operationally for a few months whilst you're going through this change. So here we're looking at lack of visibility and oversight. So we're looking at error and fraud, with error being unintentional errors that happen as a consequence of inconsistent processes or systems. Fraud is obviously the next level, where there is an intentional purpose to commit fraud to the business, but ultimately the output can be the same as an error, that the systems and the processes are allowing somebody to make those material errors, which is impacting the cash or the profits of the business. So to mitigate this, we would be looking at going back to the risk register that we discussed about, because all of this would be on the risk mapping. It'd be, these are my biggest risks. Am I exposed? Error and fraud would typically be one of those risks. But then you'd be looking at that practically in terms of business, like where are we biggest exposed? Now that looks at people, processes and systems, because it looks at what do people do? How do they do them? And what are they allowed to do? And out of all of those 3 things, how are they then measured with key financial information checked? And this then comes back to, do the reports and the systems report information correctly? Because if the actual system doesn't report information correctly, then this is where, even if those things happen, it's like, how do you actually pick it up and put things in place to mitigate it? So you would usually assess, implement, and then look at what needs to be in place on an ongoing basis to do spot checks to make sure that those systems and processes don't break, or they don't need to evolve as the business evolves. So the core insight really is that we've looked at how risk, error and fraud can bring high financial or potential governance risk to a business that puts either the owner or the business at significant risk. So growth does increase complexity far more than I think businesses realise, and that's often the point where businesses begin feeling harder to run long before anything has actually failed. So in most of these scenarios, these businesses are trading well, they've got great customers, high cash balances, and actually real great growth opportunity, and it actually can only take one high risk material thing to happen unexpectedly that can literally close the business overnight. So it isn't really to put the risk of fear into people, but it's to make people aware that the exposure could be there. And as you're, and we're looking at, this podcast is built around helping people exit readiness, acquisitions, and understanding how your decisions you're making in the business are impacting the value and your long-term financial wealth in the business. The key themes that's come up in this podcast today is that growth increases complexity faster than the business increase structure. And that's often the point where businesses begin feeling harder to run before anything's failed. So most businesses that can encounter these problems are successful. They have high cash, real high growth expectations, and are often increasing every year on year. But that doesn't mean silently the risks aren't there. And it can just take one big risk that can close a successful business overnight. So this isn't to put the scare factor into people, but ultimately the risk exposure is there. And it's, are you pragmatically putting things in place to see what they could be, and can you mitigate them? Because ultimately, once you put it in place, it does give the owner more confidence in the business and reduce the risk of that financial risk and the financial and legal risks in the business. So most businesses don't become difficult to operate overnight. It's happened gradually through weak systems, unclear ownership, operational dependency, and small inconsistent processes becoming normal over time, which links to culture. And eventually leaderships get far more involved in day-to-day than they should because they don't trust or things are going wrong, and they lose operational confidence. Now, this is built through visibility, structure, and control, evolving alongside the business growth itself. So if you enjoyed the episode, please hit the subscribe button so other people can find the channel. I'll be sharing more conversations and insights around growth, acquisitions, operational clarity, and financial confidence in future episodes. So if these challenges you're navigating inside your own business, feel free to follow along, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.